Welcome everyone, good evening, good afternoon, and to some of you awake this early, good morning as well. Today we have our update. We are updating what we checked a bit over a week ago, which was how things were going in patch 10.0.7. We looked at the raid, we looked at Mythic Plus, we checked a few differences, for example, with the new ring coming in patch 10.0.7 and also with the balance tuning that hit patch 10.0.7 and changed, namely buffed a few specs to see how those changes were going to impact the meta of this patch. So it's been long enough now, since back then it was just a couple of days into the patch, the numbers were still very volatile and not set in stone. Now instead we have gotten one full reset and more, so it's time to check again to see how things have been settling. Especially for now, in this video, we're going to be checking on Mythic Plus. So, checking on Mythic Plus, we can start seeing the larger picture compared to last week. This was the situation last week, just a couple of days into the patch, where we already saw Protection Paladin being the more popular tank. Now, you might be wondering, well, you know, this is a situation for keys at 25 plus and higher, right? I'm not gonna be even close to playing keys at that level. This is not gonna matter for me. Not really, because the choices of the top players are going to have a trickle-down effect. So the best players will be playing a certain spec, and then the ones below them will see and then the ones below them will see that the top players are playing a certain spec, and they will try to imitate them, and the ones below those will do the same. So even if you see Prot Paladin gaining ground over Protection Warrior in the highest of key levels, that is usually also going to spiral towards the lower keys and the choices of the players in the lower keys. We can see that this week the situation is even more clear compared to last week. Now Prot Paladin is reaching a near 50% of all representation of keys at that range. So much bigger growth compared to last week, definitely passing Protection Warrior over time. This was perhaps the more expected, the more obvious of the changes when it came to the patch 10.0.7 because of the positive changes that were going the way of Protection Paladin and not really any significant changes going the way of Protection Warrior. Another set of changes which was perhaps not nearly as expected, but there was a positive feeling around it, which is the one around Restoration Shaman. So this was the situation last week, right immediately after the changes. This was the change that nerfed, of course, Preservation Evoker. Preservation Evoker got nerfed quite a bit in its toolkit, but not nearly as badly in Mythic Plus. That was perhaps the only positive of Preservation Evoker. The nerfs were more aimed at the raid. So last week, Preservation was very close at matching, but perhaps even surpassing Restoration Druid. This week, there's been a significant loss of Preservation Evoker. There has also been a slight loss, to be fair, of Restoration Druid, but a much larger loss of Preservation Evokers. Over a 20% loss of Evoker players in just over a week. What you might also notice is that there is also a doubling in player base of Restoration Shamans, which go from 7 to 15%. So now the population of Restoration Shaman, even in the highest of key levels, is increasing. So this will be bound to give a much higher representation of Restoration Shamans over time in this last part of this season as we approach Season 2. So right now there has been an addition, a third healer to the top healers in Mythic Plus with Restoration Shaman. Similar to Protection Paladin, previously we saw mostly Protection Warriors and lower down Blood Death Knights. Now we have the addition of Protection Paladin. Previously we had Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker. Now we have the addition of Restoration Shaman. We also have, unsurprisingly, perhaps the largest growth of this week and of previous weeks, to be fair, in the melee DPS camp. Because, of course, if Protection Paladin grew a lot because it was buffed in patch 10.0.7. Imagine the spec whose entire rework was about. Because Prot Paladin was only slightly buffed in the rework of the general tree, a few of the talents swapped around to make it a bit stronger, but the actual full rework went the way of Red Paladin. So when we compare the situations from last week to this week, most, if not all, of the other specs basically stayed the same, at the same level. They move barely 1%, okay, up or down, mostly irrelevant. However, we do see a Red Paladin going from 1.6 to 6.1. So they almost quadrupled in representation in a bit over a week. And this is not as simple as saying, oh well, that just means there are more Red Paladins rerolling. It's just more Paladins, getting into Mythic Plus. These are keys at 25 plus level. So quadrupling the amount of Red Paladins in the 25 plus level is quite significant, because those are not keys you can do just like that, okay? Just very, very easily and quickly. It takes quite some effort and quite some time consumption into doing these keys, and we still have quadrupled the numbers of Red Paladins, which is quite impressive in such a short period of time. So it might, of course, it's a bit too early to point out, but it might eventually grow to be another contender for the top positions in the melee DPS camp, which at the moment it has Havoc, it has Subtlety Rogue, Enhancement Shaman, and a bit lower down it has Windwalker Monk. Now Windwalker Monk has been matched by Retribution Paladin. So this seems to be the state at the moment for the melee DPS with the growth of Red Paladin. The last in line is also the more boring, the more unchanged based on the balance tuning of 10.0.7, because we still have Shadow Priest towards the top, just like last week. We still have Balanced Druid towards the top like last week. The only small, but visible still, change is the growth of Destruction Warlock, because it goes from 8.8 to 11%. Now it's actually the third most used DPS spec for the ranged in high keys in Mythic Plus. The Warlock was one of the classes overall, all three specs, which were buffed in 10.0.7, so they are benefiting from these buffs in Mythic Plus as well. It's still a long way away to be considered some sudden new meta spec for Mythic Plus, but it is still growing at its own pace, better than they were doing before anyways. So at the very least there is an improvement there for Destruction Warlocks, which have not had an amazing season, I would say, overall. So a bit of a good time towards the end, I guess it might be deserved. So we can now have here the visualization of the tier of classes and specs in Mythic Plus. This one remains unchanged, which is the one for tanks. It really still is just Protection Paladin above the rest, based on the keys completed from plus 16 to plus 28. These are the results right now. For the range DPS, there is a slight change, the slight change of Shadow Priest now being considered above the rest, and Destruction Warlock also growing a lot compared to before. As we have mentioned, Destruction Warlock was doing quite a lot of better this week. For the melee DPS, you do see also the change of Red Paladin. Red Paladin was quite lower down before, now improving a lot. It's also grown a lot in performance in Mythic Plus. And then, lastly, the post-nerf of Preservation Evoker actually knocks them down the S tier, which they have been in for basically since the start of the expansion, and also puts Restoration Shaman in the S tier for the first time in this expansion. So quite a lot of significant changes being handed out in this round of tuning in 10.0.7. We can also see even more clearly by our most popular compositions in Mythic Plus, because last week we already saw that the top tanks in Mythic Plus in terms of most popular comp were all Prot Paladin. This was, already happening, and this week is just more of the same. For healers, we now have the complete extinction of Preservation Evoker. Before, we had just a couple of Resto Shamans starting to pop up in the most popular comps, and now it's just Resto Druids and Restoration Shamans. For the DPS, there is also, of course, a massive change. Last week, we mentioned how for the first time we had an advantage of range DPS over melee DPS. Because we talked about, hey, look, there is Balance Druid, there is Beast Mastery Hunter, there is Shadow Priest, and there is even an odd Warlock and Mage. Overall, they make up for more DPS than the melee. This week, this goes away immediately, because there are still the Havoc Demon Hunters, and there are still the Rogues, and now there is a whole list of Ret Paladins, who go and take away quite a lot of Shadow Priest spots overall. So, now we have yet another return to the majority of the DPS being melee, at least your usual 2-to-1 split. So, Ret, Havoc, and Shadow. Ret, Havoc, and Destro, or Subtlety, Havoc, and Beast Mastery. So we have this type of already more common type of composition of 2 melee and 1 range DPS back this week with the growth of Retribution Paladin. So it's interesting that even in what is just a small minor 0.07 patch, which is not a major patch, we have seen the significant change in the meta for tanks, because now Prot Paladin is in with the cool guys. Then we saw the healers, where we now have Resto Shaman being in with the cool guys. For the melee DPS, we are towards seeing Ret Paladin joining the cool DPS group. So already 3 roles have had 3 changes in the meta, quite significant. And then the last one is the range DPS, which doesn't seem to have a massive change in Mythic Plus. The slightest one, as we pointed out, is Destruction Warlock, growing a little bit. For now, they are not grabbing the ticket for the cool guys group yet. They are growing, they are on their way, but still not grown enough at this point, but they are on their way. So even in this minor patch, we did see quite a lot of important changes when it comes to meta. As I said, all of this is quite interesting, not for the situation right now, not for the meta right now. Who cares right now? The season is basically over. What this matters, what this is important for, is for the incoming season 2. Is to know if, for example, Resto Shaman will be the top healer to play towards season 2, or if Prot Paladin will be the top tank to play towards season 2. So these are the important things that will matter, because as we will be getting closer to season 2, and you will start asking, who should I play, what should I reroll, which are the meta specs, who is looking the best to play for the next season in the raid or in Mythic Plus, then looking at things like these is what is going to help us determine which specs are looking the best. So this has been the recap on this weekend, on how things have been going and how have they been progressing in Mythic Plus after this, I guess, last minor patch, 10.0.7, before the new season. We will wait and see how things will progress before the new patch will come out, and then observe how the meta will evolve in the new season. But for now, we are done on this weekend. So we are starting our goodbyes, of course, by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can, of course, still support in plenty of other free ways, like liking and commenting down below, subscribing to the channel itself. Of course, you can also support me by following me over on my Twitter, down somewhere at the links right there, together with following me over on my stream on Twitch. So out with these useless things, we can now leave each other. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, this is the most light I have seen in days. My eyes are already hurting, actually.